Welcome everybody and good afternoon. This is our 2014 seed funding symposium. The reason we have this little symposium is to give you an overview of what kind of projects the Earth Institute is actually seed funding along two lines of inquiry. One is along the so-called cross-cutting initiative line of inquiry, and these are projects that require people from different disciplines to come together and work on complex problems to see what kind of answers we can get to questions that arise, across disciplines. The second one is the Earth Clinic seed funding competition, where we seed fund projects in which academic insight, knowledge that we gather as part of our typical research activities is applied to practical situations. And the mode there is typically that people feel that they can solve a problem by applying our knowledge to a particular site. And if it works, then a mechanism will be found to hand it off so that it will be implemented as a routine tool. If it does not work, we learn from that too. We bring it back into academia and research it further and then give it another try. So besides giving you a sense of what kind of programs we have funded and what kind of work has been done, what kind of results are coming out of that. We actually have chosen a range of projects, some of them a little bit earlier in their work, and others have worked since a longer time on it, so you will see a different range of maturity of these projects. But one major motivation also for this symposium was that on April 8th, we have the next deadline for submission of proposals for this seed funding competition. So often in the past we get questions about what are these projects actually meant to do? Is my idea fitting into it or isn't it fitting into it? Which one of the two should I submit to? And we just wanted to give you a sense what these two lines of inquiry are actually addressing, so that if you have these questions that you might actually get the answer here, get an example. If not, still feel free to contact Flora, who organized this symposium, or myself, or for the Earth Clinic, Lex Van Geen, who is sitting here. And we will do our best to answer your questions about where to submit and whether or not the ideas are actually fitting the seed funding spirit. So we have 5 presentations. The first 3 are cross-cutting initiative projects. They will be presented by Lisa Johnson, Mike Sherrard and Jörg Schäfer. They will be 15 minutes each, and they will be followed by 5 minutes of Q&A. Then we have 2 where we actually selected projects that have both aspects. They have an Earth Clinic flavor, but they also have a CCI component to them. And these are the projects of Johannes Jurpalainen and Brendan Buckley. Because they address both aspects, they will the presentations on these projects will be 20 minutes, also followed by a 5-minute Q&A. There is some food in the back, so during the Q&A, feel free to get some coffee, some drink, some snack. We are not taking a formal break in the session because the session is relatively compact and short. So without further ado, let's start with the first presentation by Lisa Johnson from the Wales Columbia Center on Sustainable International Investment. She is an associate research scholar there, and it's related to, or it's part of the Columbia Law School. The title of her presentation is Bridging the Gaps Between Investment Law and Environmental Policy, Developing Resources for Policymakers and Treaty Negotiators. So Lisa, please.
Thank you very much for the support and for having us here. I am with the Valley Columbia Center on Sustainable International Investment, and the project that we receive support for is on bridging gaps between investment law and environmental policy, resources for policymakers and treaty negotiators. And the area that I work in is looking at international investment treaties. And international investment treaties are instruments concluded between governments, between different countries, in order to protect foreign investment. And the idea behind the treaty is that the protection given to foreign investors will then facilitate flows of foreign investment that will then in turn stimulate sustainable development. What the treaties do, the way they work, is that they impose obligations on the host state. So those are the states that receive the investment. And the obligations that they typically impose, there's a core set that you can find in all of these treaties. And there are about 3,000 of these treaties that exist worldwide now. The two of the obligations, national treatment and most favored nation treatment, relate to impose obligations of non-discrimination. So it prevents governments from discriminating against foreign investors. And the obligations on expropriation, fair and equitable treatment, those constrain governments' abilities to treat, the expropriation is to take an investor's property without paying compensation. And the fair and equitable treatment is a broad type of catch-all provision. So the reason I'm going over this is that there's some type of, these are the instruments that we look at to see what types of tensions there are between these treaties and environmental policy. The umbrella clause is in a provision in the treaties that would require governments to abide by any obligation owed to a foreign investor in a contract or under its general law. And then restrictions on performance requirements and restrictions of free transfers of capital are generally less related to environmental provisions, but they also are restrictions on government's treatment of foreign investors. So what these investment treaties do is that they allow foreign investors, if an investor feels that the government has violated the treaty, the investor can then sue the government via private investor state arbitration and then seek claims for money damages. So it's different from a normal domestic system of litigation where if you as a company, a U.S. company operating in the U.S. wanted to challenge government action, you would typically proceed through court. And through these treaties, there's a whole separate mechanism set up where investors can then sue the governments via arbitration and seek a separate realm of damages and relief for government conduct. And these awards are also very strong and binding pursuant to two additional treaties that I really won't get into. So investment arbitration, this is where the investors sue the governments. It's something that's been on the rise over the past 15 years. And we've seen an increase in the number of treaties from 0 to 3,000. That has facilitated some of the increase in the disputes. There's also been an increase in worldwide foreign direct investment. I think that has also facilitated an increase in the disputes because there's just more foreign investors and investment. And when I say foreign investors, what I'm typically referring to is a multinational corporation. So a foreign investor is when they set up a subsidiary in the host country receiving the investment. There has been an expansion of multinational corporations. That's another factors prompting the disputes. And a final factor I would say is an increase in creative lawyering and using the treaties in different ways to sue governments for regulatory conduct. So now we've seen that the first dispute was in 1987, and now there have been over 500. I think it's closer to 600 now, but most of these, or many of these disputes are not public, so it's hard to get an accurate count of how many there are. So this shows the rise in investor-state arbitrations now. On an annual basis, the rise has been somewhat steady, but now about 500, 600 cases. So the question that we wanted to look at is how, with these states or investment treaties and states increasingly being sued, how can states minimize their liability while protecting their legitimate regulatory freedom in environmental and other areas? And so the sub-questions that we wanted to look at is what are the tensions between investment treaties and environmental law and policy? So what we investigated, or what do the treaties say? Do they include protections and carve-outs for environmental and other public policies? To what extent and to what frequency are environmental and other regulations being challenged in investment disputes? And what are the factors that are giving rise to liability? So what we did in order to look at those questions, we did a review of investment treaties. I mean, obviously not all 3,000, but a significant share of the investment treaties, and looking at the clauses and what they required of governments and what types of carve-outs and protections they would have for public policy measures. And then we conducted a review of decisions. We reviewed actually all publicly available decisions under investment treaties and created a database to code the issues that were being raised and then the decisions that were being issued. And what we found is that there are very real tensions between environmental and other regulations and investment treaties. So we've seen, for example, a US company using one investment treaty. An easy example of an investment treaty is the NAFTA. U.S. company using the NAFTA to challenge Canada's imposition of a moratorium on fracking permits. Another case that we've seen is a non-renewal of a permit for disposal of hazardous waste. The investment treaty was used to challenge that. A change in the liability regime that would enable private citizens to sue companies for environmental harms. Strengthening of environmental regulations challenging mining. Those are some of the examples of cases that investors have used investment treaties to raise. And in each of these disputes, the investor also would bring a case under the domestic courts, and invariably, it can pend simultaneously along with these investment disputes, or even if the investor lost before domestic courts, can also use this investment treaty as another mechanism for seeking relief. So we found that the investors were using treaties to challenge environmental regulation, even that regulation that was consistent with domestic law. Then we found that in the treaties, because governments have been recognizing that the treaties were being used to challenge some of the public interest measures, there is an increasing trend to include provisions in them carving out protections for environmental public policies. So you'll see, for example, in the definition of expropriation, more and more treaties will have a provision saying a good faith regulatory measure designed for a public interest purpose, such as environmental regulation, is generally not considered an expropriation. So you have some narrow carve-outs. But what we also found is that those carve-outs are very limited. So you might have a carve-out for the expropriation provision, but most investors are succeeding under a different provision, which is the fair and equitable treatment provision. And that is the main clause that investors are using to bring claims and the main clause that they're succeeding on. So some of the narrowing provisions might not have the effect that governments might hope that they would. Fair and equitable treatment, we found that that is the key basis for liability. It's the provision that investors are succeeding on most frequently. We also found that most disputes are arising in particular areas of investment. So investments in extractive industries and investments in infrastructure are the areas in which are triggering most types of disputes. And that there was relatively strict liability on governments for changes in the regulatory framework. So if an investment were made under a framework that looked like scenario A, and it subsequently changed in a way that impacted expected profits, the investment treaty tribunals would interpret the ability of a government to change its regulatory framework in a way that was much more strict than a domestic jurisdiction, court jurisdiction, for example, in the US, would approach the issue. And then we also found that the ability to and I think this was somewhat surprising, the ability to implement the treaty well was not necessarily a factor on whether or not a government would be faced with claims. So for example, the US and Canada have a very robust system for communicating treaty obligations downward and horizontally so that the states understand what the treaty obligations are and that different branches of government also understand. But they are still faced with a significant number of claims, and even more so than some of the states that might not take the same steps to make sure that treaty obligations are known. So it wasn't being faced with a dispute isn't necessarily a question of implementation. It's more a question of what type of investment you're getting. Oh, wow, I have a lot. So this is just showing the different sectors that some of the claims relate to, but investment in extractive industries and infrastructure are the main ones. And I just wanted to show as well that there's a diverse set of respondent states that are being faced with these actions, and it's, I think, roughly 100 now countries have been sued using investment treaties from around the world. So what we now, in terms of what states can do, this is the second part of the project, in order to try and avoid liability for regulatory action. And that's what we were mainly focused on, is investment treaties that are designed in a way to protect foreign investors from egregious actions such as an expropriation and allow them to get compensation for that if there is no domestic court system that's functioning, that's not corrupt. But in a way they're being used in another way to challenge regulatory action. So we wanted to address that specific issue and see what can states do to protect their freedom in that particular context. And so one initial thought was, to help states understand what the treaty obligations mean and make sure that they could implement them in a way that would avoid claims. But a con that we identified as the project proceeded is that that's both resource intensive for a developing country government to communicate to all actors in its government who are working on developing or in connection with an extractives project or an infrastructure project. Educating them about what an investment treaty mean would take a lot of resources, and this issue of implementation might not result in any less disputes in the end. So we think that a better way to focus the energy is really kind of centering on the amount and the sectors in which the investments are happening, and really, though, looking at addressing the way that the treaties are interpreted. So it's not so much an issue of how the treaties are being implemented, but more of a question of how they're being interpreted by the decision makers. And that there are mechanisms that states can take in order to kind of control the interpretation of existing treaties and to craft their future treaties in a way that will protect the regulatory space a bit better than it has been so far. So in future treaties, the research is used to identify ways to include more protections and carve-outs for environmental and other public interest measures. And for existing treaties, there are tools that are available under international law for states to use their interpretive authority to clarify what they meant. So, for example, that the fair and equitable treatment clause shouldn't be used as a way to challenge government conduct for good faith and legitimate public policy measures. So we've gone to a number of workshops and given presentations on the findings of the research. And so the Academy of Global Governance in Florence, Italy, and UNECA in Kinshasa in the DRC, and GIZ in USAID. We presented some of the research there. So the idea is that there are mechanisms now that states can use to identify really what are the low-hanging fruit in terms of exposure to liability and how they might be able to prevent claims for some of their regulatory steps. Some of the next steps that we will be taking, we have a few reports that are published, so disseminating those more widely, using those also in additional workshops. And we have continued interest from a number of partners. For example, UNCTAD, the UN, is interested in a lot of the work that we're doing on existing treaties and how to make sure that they're being interpreted in a way that was consistent with states' understanding of the agreements. And then we also think that because it really isn't so much an issue of implementation as an issue of interpretation, is also working with the arbitrators to have a different approach to interpreting and applying the agreements so that they are used more to protect against egregious action as opposed to protect against regulatory change. And that is it.
Thank you, Lisa. We have time for questions. Yes.
What percentage of those arbitrations pertains specifically to environmental?
I mean, the rough calculation that we did from our review was about 50%.
Christoph?
Of the 600?
Right. Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering about whether you can give us a sense of the data that you use. Is it publicly available, like newspaper articles? Are you interviewing people? What's the methods, basically?
There are different places that the awards or the decisions will be published. So there are a few sources where awards or decisions might be leaked. So there's a website called ITA Law that collects some of that information. And so we went through that in order to look at the decisions and the awards, which is the repository of all really leaked information. And then for the treaties, UNCTAD, a UN agency, collects all of the treaties. And so we use that to review the treaties.
You mentioned arbitration. How are the people who make these decisions selected? That seems to be important.
Right, and I think that is the main issue, is that typically each side will appoint an arbitrator, and then the two of them will agree on a third. But the background of most of these arbitrators is in private commercial litigation, and so less commonly familiar with public international law, but very, very much less commonly familiar with any kind of domestic law, which I think would be where a lot of kind of the background on environmental policy would be relevant.
Okay. I think that's about it. So, thank you, Lisa, again.
Excuse one more question, please. Is there a category of investment? I'm sorry. Is there a list of the category of investments that the treaties you've looked at? What types of investments were made?
The investments covered by the investment treaties can range from anything from an asset like a house to a subsidiary of a mining company. I mean, it can be pretty much anything because the treaties...
I appreciate that, but
yeah.
did you by coincidence, and I make a list of the corresponding investments that you looked at in the treaties? It's just a question.
Yeah, I mean, they cover everything. They cover literally any type of asset is what the treaties cover.
No, the treaties you looked at, did you by coincidence make a list of the types of investments that corresponded to the treaty, the investments in the treaties that you looked at?
No, we don't have any list.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we will continue. Thank you, Lisa, again. We will continue with a presentation of a project by Mike Sherrar, who's the Andrew Sabin Professor of Professional Practice in the Columbia Law School. Mike is also the director of the Center for Climate Change Law, and he will talk to us about legal issues faced by threatened island nations.
So about 4 years ago, we were approached by Philip Mueller, who was then the permanent representative of the Republic of the Marshall Islands to the United Nations. He's now their foreign minister. He said that some decade, they don't know what decade it is, but some decade they're going to be underwater. And that raises a whole host of novel legal issues. If a country is underwater, is it still a state? Does it still have a seat at the United Nations? What happens to its exclusive economic zone and its fishing rights? What is the citizenship of its displaced people? Who has to let them in? Where will they go? Do they have any legal remedies against the greenhouse gas emitters that made this happen? We did not have the answers to those questions right off the bat, and we decided that we should convene an international conference of legal scholars to address the legal issues faced by island nations that are threatened with submersion. The Earth Institute provided a $25,000 cross-cutting initiative grant to us to start with the planning for the conference. We were then able to raise a total of about $300,000 from the World Bank and from the governments of Australia, South Korea, and Israel, which allowed us to have a 3-day conference on campus in May of 2011 and to bring in a total of about 200 people from all around the world, including many from some of the Pacific Island nations. What I would like to do would be to show you some slides and then tell you, to set the context, and then tell you a little bit more about what our activities have been over and above the conference that was enabled by the cross-cutting initiative grant. The first question I really had to answer when Ambassador Mueller called me is, where the heck are the Marshall Islands? And I learned that they are about halfway between Hawaii and Australia, that they consist of 29 atolls, that the capital atoll is Majuro. I was also reminded that an atoll is basically the residue of an extinct volcano, that the volcano is gone and it leaves a rim, and then over the eons it's replaced by a coral reef. So this is Majuro, the capital atoll. The continuous length is about 30 miles, and the typical width is about the distance between Broadway and Amsterdam. When you go there, fly into the airport, as I've done twice. Took some pictures. So there's one little road that runs through the middle of it. This is one of the narrower parts, and you can see the lagoon on the left and the ocean on the right. The water is really there. Some of it is already eroding. I'm told that this had been a lush forest. This fellow has a coastal property. Well, they're all coastal properties. But this fellow tried to build up a seawall to provide protection, although this obviously does not provide much protection. Since they don't have, it's a coral reef and they don't have soil, they bury their dead in vaults, and this vault will not be here very long. I was told that there were previously 2 other rows of vaults which have already gone, but people swim in the water right outside there, as you can see. This sort of thing is happening with increasing frequency, this sort of flooding event, and this highlights one thing that I didn't really appreciate, that a place becomes uninhabitable before it is submerged. That extreme flooding happens with such frequency. In the first place, the salt water washes over the island and contaminates the water and contaminates the soil, so you can't grow much. The connectivity of the atolls is cut off, and real hazards are presented. There is now a law that new homes need to be built at least 3 feet up to withstand sort of annual, what they call spring tides, but obviously this is not going to help much with significantly higher sea level rise. The elevation on the island, on all these islands, is basically about 2 or 3 meters. There are no high points. When I was there, I asked someone, what do you do if there's a tsunami warning? And he said, well, you tie yourself to a coconut tree. This is the airport. The airport also serves as their principal source of potable water. Since their groundwater resources have been contaminated with salt, what they now do is to collect the rainwater runoff from the airport runway, and that is their principal source of potable water. They also collect water from the rooftops. The EU has paid for this kind of collection system. This is at a local Catholic school, and this area doubles as a recreation area and a catchment area. The platform below it has water collection as an additional means of water security, which is a major problem. This is just a picture I took of the local road and a school bus and of some kids waiting at a bus stop. So these exemplify the future of the Marshall Islands. The past of the Marshall Islands is signified by this. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States conducted its outdoor nuclear weapons testing program in the Marshall Islands, detonating a total of 67 nuclear weapons over Bikini Atoll and Eniwetok Atoll. They became so common that people would go out and they would watch the atomic bombs go off, which is not necessarily the world's safest recreational activity. And as you can imagine, to this day, there's a lot of controversy about the lingering effects of that. In the bar in the airport, the decorations include one of the hydrogen bombs, and then the upper right you see the Bravo shot. It's a drink here, but the Bravo shot was actually the largest hydrogen bomb to ever exploded over the Marshall ever by the United States. It exploded over the Marshall Islands exactly 60 years ago. It was much larger than anticipated. The wind patterns were different. It spread extreme radiation over large parts of the country. And over the weekend, I was down in Arkansas. I'll explain why Arkansas in a minute, for Nuclear Remembrance Day at the Bill Clinton Library in commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the Bravo shot. At the local school, I took a picture of a science project, sort of the atomic bombs that have been dropped in my country. This is Bikini Town Hall, but it is not on Bikini. It's on Majuro, the capital atoll. That's because Bikini continues to be uninhabitable because of the radiation. And this may be a foretaste of the future of the country itself, this sort of with a seat of government away from where the country actually is. Next to Bikini Atoll Town Hall is Rongelap Town Hall, same thing, it's uninhabitable because of the radiation. In 2006, the United States entered into a compact with the Republic of the Marshall Islands, under which they became an independent nation. They're a sovereign state with a seat at the UN. This is the House of Parliament. Democratically elected government. One of the provisions of the compact was that people from the Marshall Islands could freely come to the United States and work here. About 10,000 Marshallese have now settled in and around Springdale, Arkansas, because Springdale, Arkansas has a large Tyson's food plant that hires large numbers of Marshallese for menial labor. So I took this last Thursday. This is the picture that almost got me arrested. As I went into the front gate to take the picture, a security guard charged out and made it very clear that without permission this was not allowable, but I escaped with my liberty and my camera. Very nearby is the consulate of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, located next to a barber shop. Because there's such a large Marshallese population there. I visited there. This is me with the Consul General, Carmen Chun, and in front of the picture of the President and so forth, hence the necklace, which I was, of Marshallese shells that I was given there. And I met, and they had many Marshallese come and for this meeting. So going back to the conference that was funded with initially by the Earth Institute, we enlisted a number of Earth Institute scientists to help us with the presentations. Mary Elena Carr, who's an oceanographer who was with the Columbia Climate Center, gave a presentation about sea level rise projections. Klaus Jacob, who many of you know, gave a presentation about certain engineering options, and so did some students from the Climate and Society program. We had issued a call for papers and received a large number of papers. We had the conference, which was a terrific success. One thing that emerged from it is this book, which was published by Cambridge University Press. Although it is now selling for about $150, the paperback edition is coming out soon for $35. So any of you who would like the book, it will be readily available. Another thing that grew out of it is growing out of some conversations at the conference. The Marshall Islands and Palau made an attempt to get in front of the International Court of Justice in The Hague with the claim that the major developed countries have an obligation to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions so the small island nations don't drown. It would only have been an advisory opinion since neither the United States nor China, the world's two biggest emitters, have acceded to the mandatory jurisdiction of that court for this kind of case. But it could have gone there for an advisory opinion with a majority vote of the members of the United Nations General Assembly. The U.S. actively opposed that resolution, and ultimately it was only able to get about 30 supporters out of the 195 members of the UN. So I've been to the Marshall Islands twice, first in December of 2010, where the President and the Cabinet greeted me at the airport. And among other things, I was able to go to Eniwetok and visit a radioactive waste disposal facility that is almost unknown outside of the country that I'll mention again in a minute. And I was there this past September for a large conference. Growing out of that, I met with some people from something called the Pacific Sustainable Shipping Center, who were interested in finding ways to regulate the emissions of greenhouse gases from the shipping that goes through that area of the Pacific. That raised some very complex issues under the UN Conference on the Law of the Sea and GATT and others, and so we've done a study of that, and my colleague Meredith Walensky, who's one of our fellows, is probably going to Fiji in July to present that at a conference there. President Lowiak, fellow in the back, gave us a major address here as part of the world's Leaders Forum at Low Library last September. The previous year, we hosted Mohammed Nasheed, the then recently deposed president of the Maldives, who was another major spokesman for the small island nations. We have brought over from the Marshall Islands a young scientist who's now studying in the Climate and Society program. Money has been raised for a Pacific Island Fellowship, which will bring over more people from that region. A number of student projects have emerged. One law student wrote a paper that was just published in the Columbia Journal of Environmental Law about the immigration status of these people. Some students drafted a treaty that the Marshall Islands would like to take around to some of the other countries. We're exploring a number of litigation options that may be available. And the final thing I wanted to mention is that I mentioned the Springdale and the Nuclear Remembrance Day ceremony that took place at the Clinton Library, and I discussed this radioactive waste facility in the late 1970s when the U.S. was getting ready to pack up and move out. They decided to clean up Eniwetok a little bit by scooping up a lot of the radioactive waste, dumping some of it in the lagoon, but for the plutonium-contaminated material to take the crater that had been left over by one of the atomic bombs and dumping that plutonium waste into the crater, no lining or anything, covering it over with an 18-inch slab of cement and leaving. So while I was there, I was taken to this area. It has no fence, no sign, no guard, no anything. And the person who was on the boat who took me there ran on top of the dome. And so I ran up on top of the dome and was thinking, first of all, holy cow, I'm standing on behalf of 100,000 tons of plutonium waste. And secondly, it's exposure times time, right? And if I'm not here very long, it's probably okay. And I've already had my children. So I stayed there for about a minute and soaked it in. But it happened that over the weekend, a report came out, a pre-publication copy of an article in Environmental Science and Technology, finding that plutonium from the Marshall Islands has been traced to the South China Sea. That they were able to trace the nature of the plutonium and its age to the South China Sea, which raises a whole host of very interesting legal issues that we're going to be exploring in the coming months. To be continued. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Any questions for Mike? Jörg?
Coming back to your mentioning that before the island is gone, it's way earlier that you cannot live there anymore. I mean, it does look pretty close already. I mean, when are they? I mean, there must be predictions when they have to leave the island, which is probably within decades in this case, right?
I think it's a matter of decades, partly, and actually we're doing a project now on the definition of habitability, which is a culturally determined phrase, and some people will have greater tolerance than others. There will be some land left into the 21st century. Question is how much will people tolerate?
How many people live there? Oh.
The country has a population of about 60,000, of whom about 30,000 now live in Majuro, plus another 10,000 or so in Arkansas, and a couple of thousand in other parts of the United States.
So is the atmosphere, last question, is the atmosphere that they think of leaving all together, abandoning
when the president was here, I asked him that question. We're going to stay.
Oh, wow.
I think younger people don't necessarily have that view, and I think the migration is continuing. Maybe a few hundred a year. I think it's continuing.
Two questions. Do we have a panoramic view of the numbers of islands that are threatened and the estimated time levels of flooding across the globe?
So the nations whose entire survival is threatened are about half a dozen. The Marshall Islands, Palau, the Nauru, Maldives, maybe one or two others. But
what about the Caribbean?
There are, so far as I know, no nations that are imperiled, but there are lots of individual islands, many, many individual islands. Some are already gone, and some of them are inhabited. So the disappearance of islands is happening on an ongoing basis.
And we don't have a panoramic view of that. For example,
no, I've asked for that, but I'm not aware that anybody has put.
Who did you ask, if I'm asking? Maybe we should support you to get it. I mean, no, seriously, maybe we should support the Earth Institute to get it.
That's a different discipline, and maybe some of the other people would like to do that.
Okay, fine.
I'm just a lawyer.
Fine.
But I think
well,
there are people who could do that.
Good lawyer.
Have you found any disease that is actually associated with the exposure of the radioactivities?
It is widely thought in the Marshall Islands that they have many instances of birth defects and cancer that are attributable to this. And I think the science is still out on causation. But they believe they have a high incidence of cancer and birth defects.
Michael, what arguments were made at the General Assembly on the Small Island Nation proposal that defeated it?
That there are ongoing United Nations negotiations growing out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and this would be an unwelcome diversion. Of course, those negotiations are leading so far to almost nothing constructive, but that was a major argument that was raised.
Okay, and that's the last question.
It sounds like the U.S. has no transparent monitoring program in place of any sort. Of what is the radioactivity that's still spread around various parts of these atolls?
So 2 years ago, there was a paragraph inserted in an Insular Affairs Act that required the United States to undertake ongoing monitoring of radiation at RUNIT, the facility I talked about. The DOE was there in May and June of 2013. And has not yet released the results to the government or the public.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
We will now move from more legal aspects to climate, cryosphere, and energy connections. And this is a project that is done by Jörg Schäfer and Pierre Centin. Jörg will present. Jörg is Lamont Research Professor at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. The title of his talk is Glacier Change and Energy, Test Case Rhone River.
So this will be much less dramatic. Although it's compared to many of the research projects I do, it's very applied. And I also want to stress, and I hope I make this clear through the talk, that this cross-cutting initiative program for people like me, being mostly involved in basic research at Lamont, is of really incredible value, particularly if you look in the rapidly changing funding environment in the US. If you read the mission statement of the modern NSF programs like science, engineering, education for sustainability, Cs, where a lot of money is flowing in, it's almost a spitting image of the cross-cutting initiative in the Earth Clinic mission statements, and then both of these programs were before Cs. So I really think it's very valuable as a stepping stool for bigger NSF-based projects, and I really expect and hope that many of these projects come through the cross-cutting initiative and Earth Clinic programs into the cross-cutting NSF system. So I introduced this project. Is pretty young. We were funded in the last round, so we are in our early steps. We have been in the field once, and I date you quickly up. What I'm talking about is the connection between features like you see here in the back, glacier and glacier change. This is the Rhone Glacier about 100 years ago, and I will show you in a second that this looks very different now, and how this dynamics of glaciers connects to energy production and in general downstream societies. And we apply that program to Rhone River, the Rhone Glacier system, Rhone catchment and the Rhone River. And I walk you through the talk and let you know why this is a good way to do it. This is cross-cutting. I am an environmental physicist, geochemist, doing a lot of paleo-glacier work. I'm doing that, I'm doing that together with Pierre Gentin and student Léo Lemordon at the Columbia Water Center, who is taking on the hydrological part of this. And very essential is Summer Rupert and her student Torben Kieler from Brigham Young University. She is one of the leading modern glaciologists, glacier physicists, who is looking into the dynamics of these features. This was triggered by two relatively recent events coming out of France. One is plotted here. This is just the development of electricity production in France since 1980. And you see this yellow elephant here, which is now dominating the electricity production completely. This is nuclear power. So the French are totally dependent on nuclear power. And many of these nuclear power plants are sitting along the Rhone River. And as you know, you need to cool nuclear power plants. And then in 2005, they had a first of several really disturbing summers where the Rhone River level dropped to a degree that these nuclear power plants heated up the river to a degree that was not acceptable and actually against the law. There is an environmental law in France that if the Rhone River or any river gets heated above 25 degrees by the nuclear power plants, you have to switch them off. And they indeed, it looked like this summer that they have to shut off a significant part of their 58 nuclear power reactors. It ended up to be only a few, but among them the Tricastin plant, which is one of their biggest. And it was a shock wave, I think, that went through the society. You cannot heat it higher because you start killing the fish and all the animals in it. So this happened several times. It does not happen every year, but it happens more and more frequently, I assume. And the basic goal of this project is really to look into to what degree do the shrinking glaciers contribute to that downstream problem and evaluate that. So another reason why Rhone Glacier and Rhone catchment and the Rhone River is a very nice study area is there's a wealth of data. These glaciers in Switzerland are extremely well monitored, and there's a huge database we can dig in. This is just a reconstruction from our colleagues at ETH about the glacier change since 1874. So the time is up there ticking. You have the first pulse of retreat over until the 1900s. Then you have a stabilization between 1910 and 1940. You see these fluctuations. There were advances in between, and that's where we are now in 2006. This is actually I shouldn't. So there's a significant ice loss, and you see also the thinning in the accumulation area of the glacier up there. So there's a lot of retreat dynamics. And 1874, we were already about 20 years after what is called the Little Ice Age. For you who are not experts in that field, about 1850 Common Era, the glaciers basically around the globe were at their last peak before they kind of collapsed. And in many areas, like in Switzerland, Scandinavia, this peak was the dominant one during the Holocene, which is the warm period over the last 11,500 years in that we live and that societies developed. So this was a substantial glacier advance. And then it started collapsing, 1850, and there is still a huge discussion why. And I come back to that. So our integrated cross-cutting approach involves climate science or paleoclimate science. We have glaciology, hydrology, and the fourth step then will be to implement all of that and to synthesize that and ask the question, how much will this actually cost downstream? We have to improve our understanding of the climate sensitivity of glaciers and of the Rhone Glacier and the Rhone catchment glaciers in general. The glaciology and glacier modeling that's done at Brigham Young uses our paleo reconstruction of the glacier to calibrate the model combined with the modern observations, and we hope to provide more robust predictions of the glacier and the meltwater change over the next 50 and 100 years. And then we go into the impact assessment of glacier runoff changes. What does this mean for the Rhone glacier fluctuations? And we are also working with economists in France from the Électricité de France to transform that information into mitigation strategies for their electricity production. So I want to give you one quick example about the paleo aspects. And again, this is concerning the Little Ice Age, and why did the Little Ice Age stop and end, and what happened, what is driving the glacier dynamics since. And it's a very naive approach, but it's not that visible in the literature yet, and I really don't understand why this is. If you walk through glaciers, 4 fields around the globe outside Antarctica, let Antarctica beside, Antarctica is a different animal. But anywhere else, you see basically the same picture. You see one of dramatic glacier retreat over the last 150 years. I show you some photographs, always the oldest that I couldn't find. This is the Rhone Glacier again. This is not far, it's away from in the west of Switzerland, the Matterhorn. Here it's 1900, the glacier is already back from this position here, which is the classic Little Ice Age extent. And then today most of it is gone. New Zealand, very similar thing. You have one prominent moraine, that's the Tasman Glacier, the biggest in the Southern Alps of New Zealand, and then 1850 a retreat began. That's ongoing, and you lost a lot of ice. In the Himalayas, this is China and this is Bhutan, same story. You have these glacial retreats and these lakes form, and these lakes are kept in place by these moraines. It's the same thing. This process started about 1850. Tropical Andes, gorgeous little ice age moraines, about 1850, glaciers started moving back. Same here, Calcaya ice cap. It was just featured in the New York Times a few days ago, my colleague Meredith Kelly. And finally back to the Swiss Alps. So I could go on, and what I want to point out there is this is a picture of a very robust global glacier signal. And for me, that means that only a global driver is really in the room to explain that. If you look more quantitatively, it gets even better. That is, all these glacier retreats in 1850, they represent about the same glacier and climate change. So that works also quantitatively. The only difference, the really only difference, is that they didn't all start exactly 1850 on the Wednesday. Some of them hang out until 1860, some even 1870. So there is a certain delay. And this delay in onset of retreat after Little Ice Age still dominates actually the literature, and there was just a very recent highly featured paper on an excellent group of scientists in PNAS. They identify or suggest strongly the end of the Little Ice Age in the Alps forced by industrial black carbon, which if you look globally, the black carbon in the Swiss Alps of course went about up in the right time. So you could explain that. But the black carbon in the Himalayas or in New Zealand does not even play a role. In the Himalayas it might be important, but it definitely started later. In the tropical Andes and in New Zealand it does not matter. So for me, this does not really make sense, or for us. And we think this is a way easier scenario, which is actually worse. It's easier for the modeling, but it's worse for society. That's the curve from 1250 AD to today, a little bit after today. And the purple points are the CO2 in the atmosphere. And that's the line here, 1850. That's the earliest point when glaciers started to react. There's not a single glacier that really started to leave the Little Ice Age position much before that. Glaciers were sometimes in Scandinavia a little bit outside, but they were basically on the same amplitude. But after that, all of them retreated fast, and that's about the time range you have. So sometimes, so any time between 1850 and 1875, any glacier, mountain glaciers would start to retreat back. And first, all the back of the envelope estimates, actually, indeed, the ones that hang out until 1875 were the bigger ones, which are more sluggish. All the glaciers integrate climate signal over a certain amount of years. The small ones, typically a few years, the big ones up to 10, 15, 20 years, and you can easily understand that. If you have an integrator over 20 years and you start changing the climate, it takes a little while until it reacts as strongly, and the smaller ones are faster. So all we see in our overview is totally consistent with the CO2 driving the end of the Little Ice Age, which of course feeds back into our glacier models, because then we have to assume that this will continue and the glaciers will continue to be driven by the CO2, which again is good for the modeling, but it's very bad for the scenarios. And so what we eventually need, and I'll rely again on my ETH colleagues. So Wimmon predictions like that time is again up, and that's actually a very conservative scenario until end of the next century, of this century. And you see by about 2100 we have hardly any ice left, and we don't trust this model necessarily, and we want to improve it, but that's about what we need, not only for the Rhone Glacier, but one of the big aspects of Samarupa's group work is upscaling. So she is in charge of, she's mapping out all the entire catchment for the Rhone River, which you see here, and the blue areas are the glaciarized areas. And we have to integrate about all of those ice masses and calibrate the sensitivity and predict how they will react. And then we get a more robust input into the hydrological model. These are the first very rough outputs of these mountain glacier models, and of course the glacier length collapses, and the meltwater change, it's actually interesting, this is data, the meltwater change from the Rhone Glacier catchment went up over the last 20 years, which is what you expect if you melt more ice, and then the prediction is almost that this curve will go somehow down. At one point you're just reaching the tipping point and then you fall down. One of the really big goals of this project is to put us on this map. Where are we? Are we still in the rising flank, or are we already over the tipping point? And we can definitely do that. And then make, which is obviously basic, before you have that, you don't have the initial conditions of your model at all. So that's really your starting point. And we are working on that, and then this next step is we hope to upscale over the Rhone Glacier catchment over the entire Alps. Samarupa's basic focus in the moment is to develop very simplified but robust mountain glacier models, and the first versions look super promising, so we kind of will be in the position to upscale over a wider region, and that also puts us in the position to upscale to the Himalayas and the tropics. So finally, the hydrological change and impact on energy. This is Pierre Gentine's part, which is just really starting now. There was a recent paper by Haas, who looks at the Rhine, the Rhone, the Po, and the Danube glacier and river systems, and reviews how this will evolve in terms of summer melt, how important the glacier summer melt will be for these rivers. And this paper makes a very nice job in making a case that this will get more important than we think. And he estimates about 50% is a good number for the melt coming out of the glacier for these rivers in about 50 years. So this is definitely important. Another aspect beyond the hydrological input from the glaciers is, and that's something that Pierre Gentine and Léo Lemondon are working on, is to model the stream flow temperature, which is from the legal aspect a key number. So you will not stop the nuclear power plants when the Rhone River is dry. You will stop it when it's above 25 degrees. So the more relevant one is actually the temperature modeling here. And coming back again, so both together, the hydrologists and glaciologists will put us on the map and so see where we are in terms of meltwater flux change. And so timing and amplitude of the runoff peak over the next 100 years and the relationship to temperature increase is a central goal. The next steps, when we will start working with the engineers and economists in France, we need to kind of make a cost assessment of what this potentially might mean for France. Hydropower is a player more on the Swiss side, actually, on the French side, which only depends on the stream flow, and nuclear power depends on stream flow and on temperature. What is next? I really hope that after the spring 2014 fieldwork in France, we sit down and have a serious assessment of how we move on. And it's my strong feeling that we should really look into a bigger, broader proposal towards an NSFC's program. We have to intensify the solution-oriented aspects, and that's basically a call for the leadership here to provide more contacts. The economy part, we have the French colleagues. It would be really nice to get somebody interested here at Columbia in these kind of aspects. And basically, the first step would be a cost assessment and of all of that, on with all of the input the economists can get from us. And what does it matter for how much does it matter for the Rhone River powerhouse? We also have the legal aspects. I mean, I just read that in preparing this talk that the owners of this Tricastin nuclear power plant, in a, I think, pretty desperate move, they sued the French government for the costs that were on their table after they had to switch off their power plant. I have no idea how this is done legally, but it would be really nice to get somebody in the law school interested and look into that and assist and just widen our program in this direction. And finally, with Ben Olof, we have a leading glacier and climate anthropologist at Columbia, and we always try to integrate his expertise. So that's the next step. And then eventually, we hope that this gets a bigger program, and we apply exactly that kind of approach to the Himalayas and the tropical Andes, because it really seems the most appropriate way to handle these kind of problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jörg. Questions?
It's somewhat ironic that nuclear power doesn't produce the black carbon and yet is affected by it. I don't get a sense of how much of the river flow actually goes through the cooling systems, and do you expect maybe that the legislation will change? I mean, this 25 degrees limit is probably somewhat arbitrary, and you could imagine that there would be pressure to change that. So
yeah, I don't have the real numbers in mind, but I know that in these summers where they had to switch off the power plants, the Rhone River was at about 80% of the average summer level. So it was not super dramatic in that sense, but it was enough. So it seems to me that these estimations of how to get to the 25 degrees, they are pretty, there's not much buffer in them. So it does not need a catastrophic event to make this happen. I don't know. I mean, I cannot predict if they will have new legislation. I know that there is serious discussion, at least in France, about the next generation of power plants. I didn't say that, but all of their power plants are old enough that they have to replace them anyway. And it's definitely a central piece of this discussion how to do that. And these issues, I think they're operating in the moment, at least, assuming that this law will stay. And there is, in France also, there's a serious ecological movement. So it will be a major PR disaster if you start warming the Rhone River too much.
Other questions? Crystal? There is a microphone coming.
Thank you. There's one logical step in your explanation that I didn't catch. So the glacier getting smaller by melting, does that make the rivers warmer or cooler, or short-term versus long-term, or?
Well, it's not the temperature of the meltwater is not a factor, but the amount of meltwater is. So the glaciers in general act as the summer battery, so it's getting very dry in summer in this area. So the only source of water for Rhone River in August is basically they are peaking there. It's the glaciers then. And that's why we are not there yet. We don't have this curve. Over the last 20 years, the meltwater was actually increasing in August. There's huge fluctuations, but there was a trend because the glaciers were melting and dispensing more water. When the glaciers get small enough, there's a return, and then it really this curve falls down, and you will have less and less water, and then you are in trouble. So in step one, while you have reasonably big glaciers and you start melting them heavily, you are fine in terms of energy production, but you are drifting towards a threshold, and when the glacier is getting too small, and then that will be very fast, stop melting, or not provide enough meltwater in summer, then you basically will have summer after summer where you have to switch them off.
So what really happened, if I get that correct, is you had an extreme P minus E event.
Yeah.
And that sort of was overprinted on the base flow from the glacier melt. But that sort of shows you that when you take the glacier melt down, what will happen.
Yeah. So the baseline is basically that the glacier melt gives you the baseline. You will still have this precipitation fluctuations on top of it, but you will come closer and closer to the switch off threshold.
We will start with Johannes Jurpelainen, who is an assistant professor of political science here at Columbia University. So you can see the variety of backgrounds from which people who are working in that area are coming. And Johannes will talk about solar home systems for rural India, evidence from an Earth Cleaning project in Uttar Pradesh.
Thanks, Peter, for the introduction, and thanks, Flora, for setting up everything for this. So this is some work I'm doing mostly with Semi Yon, who's a PhD student in the Sustainable Development Program, and Ruth de Vries has been advising us on this project. I first want to say a little bit about, even though this talk is mostly about the Earth Clinic component, which is a field project we're doing right now, this all started with the Cross-Cutting Initiative, gave us a small grant to set up a little workshop and think a little bit about what we should do. So there is a connection, even though the total budget of the Cross-Cutting Initiative grant is about 1/10 of the budget of the Earth Clinic project. So I want to start by showing a picture from a village in Uttar Pradesh called Airobadiar. This is a village that would look quite typical for India. So this is a marketplace. There's a lot of people, high population density. One thing that's interesting about this village is that if you look at it, you'll see a power line. But this is a power line that goes from a power plant, which is based in this village. But there is not a single person in this village who actually has electricity at their home. All this power is channeled directly to Lucknow, which is the state capital, where in some of the sort of wealthier areas there's 24/7 electricity available. And it's quite a typical scene in the sense that even though in principle the great opportunities for electrification, states like Uttar Pradesh, for various political and other institutional reasons, haven't really made a lot of progress on this. And that has created a great need for alternative approaches. And one of them is using solar power for sort of distributed energy generation, giving people access to electricity even though the power sector reforms in the state are not really going anywhere and probably will not in the coming decade or so. And so what we did in this project is we wanted to try out a concept called the energy centers. So this is an idea that comes from a social enterprise called Bund. Bund means a drop in Sanskrit, and the idea here is that even if we sort of make small contributions overall, over time they will add up to a lot. And so what we did is we set up this energy center in this village that you just saw, Airobadiar, in this Unnao area, which is about an hour's drive from the state capital. And the idea of this energy center is that it's basically a small shop that sells all kinds of products. So it sells solar home systems, solar lanterns, cook stoves, water cleaning, purifying systems, a number of things mostly based on solar power or alternative clean energy sources. And then once we've set up the system, we have this little marketing campaign where we go to a set of 38 villages in the area. We show how these solar home systems work, what their benefits are. We tell them about the price and see if households are interested in buying this. And it's a randomized setting, so we have a list of all the villages in the area. We randomly chose half of them for the demonstrations and the other half are not, so we can get some experimental evidence on if the people are interested in this, are they buying the systems, and so on. And one of the sort of things we want to do also, we have a full-time researcher there in the field, and so we have continuous data on what happens in all these demonstrations, how many systems are sold, if there are any maintenance problems, so we get a very kind of rich image of how this concept is working. This guy here, Rakesh, is the owner of the solar energy shop, so he works for Bund, and he's responsible for selling the products, keeping track of things, budgeting, accounting, those kinds of things. He's basically the branch manager. And this here on the right from you is Rustam Sengupta. He's the CEO of the company who was with us in the field when we started the project. And on the left is one of his customers actually asking about solar home systems and their properties. So we only started this quite recently, so we started some preparatory work in the fall, and then we set up the energy center and did some surveys in January, so we are still at an early stage, so I don't want to sort of claim that we have been successful yet, but so far it's certainly looking very good. So there's a bank partnership between this company Bund and a local rural bank, which is a big deal because India offers a 30% subsidy for solar power for poor people, but it's only available if you work through these banks. So the fact that we were able to establish this partnership means that these products will get access to the kinds of households that would not otherwise be able to afford them, which means the development impact would be bigger. We've done a baseline survey, we already have the data, and we did 760 households in 76 villages in this area, so we know how much people know about solar power, what their sort of announced willingness to pay is, how many people they know who have a solar home system, to get a good sense of what's going on in the field. We've already done 5 demonstrations as of February 25th, when was the last data upload that I got from the field. So in 5 villages we've been showing how these systems work, keeping track of how many people come there, how many systems they want to buy, and so on. We've got more than 200 people have come to these demonstrations in less than a month, and 54 households have already sort of initiated the buying, so we get a pretty high, every 4th of the people who come to the demonstration seems to be buying. This doesn't mean that all of these people will buy because the bank has to approve the loan and all that, so there are still complications, but given this demand, we've already completed 15 sales and there's another 20 or 30 in the process right now, so this is looking quite good. We are having a good demand despite working in a very poor area. So we hope, if all goes well, we might be able to sell 500 systems in the first year, which would make the energy center basically profitable, so that we've used the grant to set it up, but from that point on it runs on its own, and as long as there is more demand, it will keep doing so for years to come. So the Colombia, I just want to give you a sense of how little it costs to do this. So the grant for implementation is only $5,000. Everything else is research. We wanted to document this very carefully, but with $5,000 we've been able to sort of reach an area of 80 villages with more than 20,000 households. Of course, not everybody is going to have the system, but we've given access to such a sort of large number of people who otherwise did not have. For example, in our baseline, fewer than 1/3 of the population knew where the closest place to buy a solar home system is, and we can probably increase that number by quite a bit. So this is I think so far it's looking like it's a good intervention, and we are very excited about both looking for opportunities for a sort of bigger grant to scale this up and go to larger areas, but also equity investment. So the company has, since we started this, they found one investor who's actually doing this for profit. So there is quite a bit of potential for expanding this operation. Okay, so here is a picture from the one of the demonstrations, and so what they did is basically they went to this area, they set up their advertisement things. The sign is just saying that this is the Bund solar shop. They have a few solar panels there, and the team is showing, you know, how these things work, what the pricing is and so on. And based on what we've seen so far from these demonstrations is that I think the kind of main concerns that people have is maintenance is one big thing. So many people in this area have bad experiences with solar power because of some failed government projects. So one of the things we really want to do is we want to work with a company that actually provides high quality products and maintains them, goes back after 6 months, after 12 months to make sure that everything works. And then the other thing is, of course, the loan. So even though these loans from our perspective are fairly small, we're talking about $200 or something like that, for this population this is actually a lot of money. So they are a little worried about their ability to make the payments on a monthly basis. So they want to know what happens if they miss 1 month or something like that. So, and when we are keeping track, we want to obviously write a report on sort of what people want to know, what their concerns are at the end, in addition to doing the experimental analysis. Okay. So let me just conclude this short presentation by just saying a few sort of things. I'm very happy about this concept of the Earth Clinic exactly because it has this kind of concrete application. So here what we are trying to do is we're trying to have a real impact and a cost-effective one. So it's a very small project, but we hope that once we've done it, we will attract more attention among investors and maybe also grant makers to try this out on a much larger scale. And in principle, the scaling up for this project is not particularly challenging because these are individual centers, so there is no reason why you cannot just start locating other areas where you set up these systems. Of course, for the company, there is the requirement that they need the management capabilities. Right now, Rustam, the CEO, is sort of personally micromanaging a number of these things, and in the future, he's going to have to hire much more staff to take care of things, because if you have 100 centers like this instead of 1 or 2, it's going to become a big challenge. But in principle, there is no reason. The labor is out there. India has many people who are willing to work for this, and the capital costs are quite small, so as long as you can get some kind of an investor, you can scale up reasonably quickly. On the academic side, one thing that I also like about this experiment is that we have a real intervention, and we're also measuring the outcomes in terms of real behavior. So while we do the surveys to get some background data, the outcome variables are measured as actual sales. So we know how much money has been moved from people, how many solar home systems have been set up, how they're working, and so on. So we're not just relying on what people are reporting to us, but we're actually getting real-time data thanks to this guy who's there working on this full time. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes. Plenty of time for questions.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I have a couple questions. Of this area where you said there's about roughly 20,000 people, you said so far 15 have purchased the system. So I was wondering if you have a sense for sort of what do you think the critical mass would have to be for it to really become sustainable, to have the business model work. What's the population density within a community that has to do it in order to be able to keep someone employed to do the maintenance and all that? I also have a second question, but I'd be interested in your...
Let me take the first one first. So my guess, based on the discussions with the CEO, is that if they can sell in this area about, say, 400 systems a year, fairly small systems for individual families, then they would be able to make a profit, a fairly good profit. In India, you have to make a high profit to survive because of the inflation and all that, and be able to have a team of 5 to 10 people employed full time. So 400 would be, if we can sell, 30 systems a month and keep doing that, then it will be sustainable.
Okay. Do you think that's realistic?
Based on what we've seen so far, yes. We are about that, so we're making a handsome profit if we keep going. Unless, of course, there's always a risk that something goes wrong, but if things keep going the way they are right now, then yes, we will be able to make it.
So my second question plays into that. Do you know if there's plans to have grid electricity brought to the area? Because I know I've worked in other places where an excellent system went into place, and then grid electricity came, and then obviously dissolved the need for it.
Okay, so in this area, that's actually not the concern. So many of the villages that we have already have electricity. It's just that in Uttar Pradesh, the quality of the electricity supply is really bad. So you get maybe 4 hours a day in the afternoon when you don't need it because the sun is shining and you're in the field. I think this business would become completely unsustainable if Uttar Pradesh was able to increase the quality of power supply, if they had more power plants, better transmission lines. But I think for the next, let's say, at least 10 years, that's a very unrealistic prospect. I haven't seen any signs of movement in that direction.
Just related to that, what is the cost, the estimated cost of that system compared to power from a grid?
So if you look at the solar home system and you are asking, like, let's say, rupees per kilowatt hour or something like that, I would say it's much higher. I would say, let's say, without the subsidy, if you take the sort of real cost of generation, maybe 5 times, and with the heavily subsidized price, let's say 10 times. So per unit, this is very expensive. And certainly solar home systems will not become a solution if you want to have air conditioning and refrigeration and so on. They're mostly being used for things like mobile charging, lighting, fans, and things like that at this point.
Oh, well, the last 2 questions preempted mine. The evolution of your project and looking at the relationship between the grid, and which you amply replied to, and those are the problems that we're having in New York City. In actual fact, I was at a Capitol presentation of MTA this week, and one of the comments as the panel left was MTA couldn't convince Con Edison to deal solar power on its own grid. So it might be interesting as you evolve in this area to look for innovative perspectives that relate to this emerged economy where we can't even get grid and solar to get across. And the other point I mentioned is that in that same mentality, I have been at a presentation on the Himalayas and the melting glaciers, and 2 observations were made. That India is building 400 dams collecting the water off the Himalayas, and China is building 500 dams. The design of the dams in India was supposedly obsolete because it didn't. But the point being is that as you develop your project, I think it might be interesting to watch those things above your head, because we could certainly use them on this side of the ocean.
Okay, so I think that's a great point. In fact, I was very surprised. I worked also on some of these solar microgrids where you set up the system and then you have a few households connected to the system. Turns out the United States is the largest country in terms of the numbers of microgrids, because the US has very high power consumption, but there are many areas, military, industrial, where you really have to have high quality power, and as a result, these companies are actually building their own systems. My guess would be that here in New York, the big one that would be relevant is the rooftop solar, so where you set up solar home systems on top of different buildings and use them at peak times, and if you can get this kind of two-way metering, which is a regulatory issue going, then I think there is a real potential. But I don't think we'll necessarily need these small solar panels to power our cell phones or anything, at least so far.
Beyond the demonstration part, which is fascinating, it wasn't clear what question you were trying to answer by having a set of control villages.
So the control villages are for 2 reasons. One of them is, so we want to see how much we sell. So the demonstration villages, my guess based on what we've seen so far, will be responsible for most of the sales. So the demonstration is important. But there are walk-in customers or phone calls from this area. So we want to see, for example, in the control group, if you have an electrified village, will you be able to sell less or more than otherwise? And so that's one reason. And then the other thing is, for these surveys, we also want to look at, for example, things like how do people's perceptions of this technology overall change, even if you look outside the households who actually buy this. So if you're in a demonstration village and other people buy a lot of the system, does it mean that you become more favorable and interested and maybe buy a smaller solar lantern? Whereas if you're in a control village, does your opinion remain the same? Is there some sort of diffusion of information across villages?
Actually, do you monitor the psychological aspects? That, I mean, why do people buy into that, and how do they kind of experience their new life with that? Is that featured? Is that
to some extent, yes. So what we are planning to do, in addition to, we had this baseline survey, we're going to do an endline survey, but that's a small sample. So even if we sell 500 systems, there's only going to be a handful here. But what we will do in the end is we're going to go and do interviews of all the people who bought them. We ask them, when did you buy them? Why did you buy them? What's your experience? Do you have any complaints? And so on. So we'll get not a kind of an experimental perspective, but at least a descriptive perspective on what the population thinks of this scheme and are they happy with it and so on.
Any other questions? Doesn't seem to be the case, so thank you again. And we will move on to our final presentation. which will be given by Brandon Buckley, who is a Lamont Research Professor at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. And he will talk about meeting the needs of ecotourism, conservation, biodiversity preservation, sustainability, and climate ecology studies in Vietnam's Central Highlands. And this again is a combination of CCI and Earth Clinic.
Really interesting group of talks today, a lot of variety, and it's good to see the breadth of what's been funded. It's quite interesting. Mine's completely different from what everyone else has been looking at too. So over the last 7 years, since about 2006, 2007, I've been working in Vietnam. And the motivation for me working there was part of this whole big Monsoon Asia climate reconstruction thing that we did in the Tree Ring Lab, 5-year project that had us going all over parts of Asia. And what we found is in Vietnam, which opened relatively recently, they also started to preserve some of these plots of wilderness land that they had, and of really quite remarkably high biodiversity value. So from a pragmatic standpoint, as a tree ring scientist looking at climate, it gave me a great resource to be able to find places that had old trees that ultimately I was able to use for reconstruction climate with. But it also revealed to us a whole slew of interesting problems that the Vietnamese are contending with, and that for people like myself who actually care quite a bit about what happens to these kinds of biodiversity resources, it opened up some opportunities to sort of shift a little bit of what we're doing and to make some of these interdisciplinary projects. So these two initiatives that we got funded here, that they're very closely linked to each other. The Earth Clinic, which I see I put EI instead of EC there, but and the cross-cutting, I did this last night and this morning, by the way, which is typical of a Lamont scientist, running around doing a variety of things. But these mesh very well with each other. In fact, they're really one project for the most part. And what we've done here is in conjunction with the research center that we've built, and I'll go into that in a bit of detail, with about $3 million worth of funding introduced by the Vietnamese government, and also JICA in Japan. We've started to develop a field school idea that would be self-sustainable and that would do a couple of things that I'll get into in a minute. And we've tentatively titled it here, Capacity Building for Indigenous Communities in the Vietnamese Highlands, by involving them in the ecotourism and research that are kind of going hand in hand right now. And then the second part of that really was a project that we had going anyways on looking at forest ecology and how drought plays a role in changing the sort of ecosystem dynamics through time. And that'll make a little bit more sense in a little while when I show you what we've done with climate reconstruction for the area. So I have several collaborators here from Lamont and from Columbia, from E3B and from DEACE. You probably know many of these people. But we have some of these colleagues that are actually from Southeast Asia, like the Vietnam Academy of Science and Technology, which has people doing a whole slew of things to deal with water and conservation of biodiversity. They're both looking at wildlife as well as plants. My focus is primarily on plants. And also the International Center for Tropical Highlands Ecosystems Research, and a rather unfortunate acronym we came out with, ICTHR. It's not that easy to say. It doesn't sound that great. But this is the center. I didn't have much. That wasn't really my idea. But I couldn't think of anything better, actually. But at any rate, so ICTHR, as it stands, is our center that now has laboratory facilities, including a DNA lab, tissue culture lab, several dormitories that have been built, and it's really becoming quite a facility. JICA in Japan is the group that's been doing a lot of the social research in the area on these indigenous communities, and this is what the focus of really both of these projects are. And the University of Los Baños in the Philippines has a couple of colleagues that are fantastic botanists and tropical forest ecologists that have helped us out a great deal in setting up forest plots. So as a bit of background, over the last 7 years, I've been working in Vietnam from the northern tip of Vietnam to this area, which is the focus area of both of these initiatives. This is the Bi Đập Nui Ba National Park. It was established in 2004. It's an area of really remarkable biodiversity. And the reason I put this map up here is a couple things. One is to show you all these triangles here. These red triangles are areas where the Vietnamese cypress is found. That's Phocaenia hodginsii. It's a tree species that lives to be more than 1,000 years, and in almost every one of these instances, you'll find at least 5 centuries old trees. So what they are is they're a cohort in old-growth forest that's remnant forest that are in these pockets that go along the Annamite range. I'm focusing really only down here, and I'm happy to talk to anyone about the rest of these areas later because they're interesting. Where we've got blue here are areas where I've been sampling. We've built records from Mukang Chai in the north and from Bidup in the south. This yellow square here is a model that predicted there would be old-growth Phocaenia there. We've confirmed that there are. Some of the biggest we've found and we've collected there just last month. And we're now working these up into a new chronology. So I have an interest in establishing this climate reconstruction for the entire length of Vietnam from 12 degrees to about 24 degrees latitude. And it gives me a really great fidelity of looking at these regional climate changes that are related to things like the putative ITCZ shift through the Little Ice Age that if I have time I'll get into a little bit. And a whole host of other things too, just from a climate perspective. What we've reconstructed actually with this is your climatology map here. You probably can't see these very well for relative humidity and temperature. But where I've circled there is the months of March, April, and May, which is that shoulder season into the precipitation of the monsoon. So it's a dry season for about 4 months of the winter, and then the monsoon kicks in between somewhere in April or May. And the trees respond, as do agricultural crops and everything. This is a very important season that's really strongly influenced by ENSO. So ENSO variability is the dominant mode of variability that we find across this entire climate regime. And so that's the season that we've reconstructed. Now, I'll give you the national park that we've been working in, which is located right where the BDFH is. This is what it looks like. It's this big horseshoe. And the center is located where that dot is. And so recently they put in about a 20-kilometer paved road that takes you in there. And it's right smack in the geographic center of the park. And part of what we're doing now, just want to set the stage here, is I've been working in all of these different locations. Like we have a permanent plot of 1 hectare that's located here. I'll show you a little bit of detail on that. And then a big area called Praying Hands here, which is the oldest growth forest we found in Vietnam so far. It has all these old conifer species. It's really quite a remarkable place. And it borders Phuc Bun National Park just off the south there. And to the north is another national park. So this forms a really large area of big biodiversity stronghold that's under great threat. Now, this is the point that we got into doing this particular project. The indigenous populations around here are nomadic hill tribes that really have no land rights. They've been living here for generations. As people with more money move in, some of these may be moving off the Mekong Delta, as that's getting inundated and becoming more crowded and having sea level rise issues. People are moving this area and forcing these people out. In the meantime, what they're doing for their livelihood are primary extraction of things like bushmeat, Phocaenia logs. These 1,000-year-old trees are being cut. There's a whole host of things that are we call it poaching, but if we lived there, we'd probably be doing the same thing. These are people trying to make a livelihood. And the whole point of this is of what JICA has been doing over the last decade, or 5 years intensively, is incorporating them into the fabric of research and education and park function. The park doesn't have enough resource to enforce rules about poaching or cutting trees or anything. So what they found, and JICA has been remarkably successful with this. I have a lot of their information if anyone's interested to look at it, on how effective it's been in getting people to become park guides, involved on ecotourism trail as guides on these things, working in the visitor center, and just essentially working for the park and recognizing that they have a more sustainable livelihood of maintaining the biodiversity here than they would if they just extract it all and just ruin the place, which is what would happen without the park being established there. So one of the things we started to do is I just ran a mock-up of this last month when I was there, of holding this sort of Earth Clinic style field week that will ultimately become a sustainable thing. So we have Columbia University involvement, which is a big part of that, having Columbia professors initially set this up. But the whole design behind this field week is that the park will ultimately run it. There'll be a budget for doing that that's obtained by charging people from countries to come and actually participate in this. We've done similar things with a Dendro Field Week globally. We run one in North America. We've run it every time we hold the World Dendro Forum. They're very well attended. People will pay substantial amounts of money to attend these things. And in this case, these would be very intensively based on research that's ongoing in the park. So the first ones that we're doing is using this ecotourism trails system that we've begun to set up. We've got 2 trails currently that are a couple of days in length. They run through permanent plots that have old-growth forests in them, of sometimes trees up to 1,000 years that we've used for climate reconstruction. And we're using the research as the vehicle to inform how the ecotourism goes. And so I'm going to talk primarily about this now, but the cross-cutting initiative is a big research part that goes along with this. So they're going to be conducted at the same time. So the people at these field schools are actually working on ongoing research projects that people like myself and many others that come from Australia, from Germany, from University of Wisconsin, University of Colorado. There's other people doing studies in here on things as varied as the DNA of fowl, of different birds that are in the park. A bunch of wildlife studies on amphibians. There's rare frogs here that, by the way, are quite delicious. And a whole, I didn't intend to eat them, but we did eat them. And so that we're working on those sorts of, that brings up the point of trying to develop a minimum impact camping regime based on what we currently do, which is kind of maximum impact when I'm with the locals. So I'm trying to bring a new culture into how things are conducted in the forest. Like having 10 campfires going that are unattended is probably not such a good idea. We're utilizing these 2 existing trails, and I'm currently building a 10-day trail system with park personnel that will go through all 3 national parks. That's in the works. And focusing on high-quality international research that's always going on. And the main thing is training national park staff and the indigenous locals that are already incorporated into the staff. And JICA has a whole series of programs that we're just tapping into that has been very effective at incorporating these people into what we're doing. So so far it looks like it's been pretty effective with what JICA's done. We were scheduled to conduct this next month, but for a variety of reasons we'll probably do it a little bit later in the year. I'll report back on how it goes. This is the trail that goes from Yang Station. It's a couple days trail. There's a couple of branches of it. It parallels the Dong Nai River, which is a famous river in Vietnam. Historically, it's a very important river. Going back 1,000 years, it's always been an area of a stronghold of military powers going back to the 1600s, 1500s. And we're working on reconstructing the flow in that as well. So a big part of what I've done is the dendrochronology. And so this is taking tree ring samples from trees that we've determined have annual rings, and that we can actually cross-date them, meaning we know the exact year that each ring was formed through a cross-dating procedure that I won't go into, and we can reconstruct climate from them from at least a couple of different species. There's, just from the conifers alone, which is what I've been focusing on, there's 36 species that represent 19 genera in Vietnam. Most of them are found in this area. The whole slew of them that I've listed here have annual rings. Many of these are, almost all of this batch is 500 years old regularly or older. And most of these have rings that I've been able to cross-date. So that the amount of information that we're beginning to develop from here is remarkable. So forget about the Earth Clinic side of this for the moment. Let's get into the cross-cutting initiative side of what we're trying to do here. We've been focusing primarily on the cypress. This Phokenia has beautiful rings. This is direction of growth. As you can see, the cells here growing in this direction. This is a tree core, 2 cores from tree 42, which is right in the corner of our plot. 750 years old. It's only missing the ring 2003 for the whole period there. So we've already used this for doing stable isotopes of oxygen and carbon, as well as doing radiocarbon calibration across the ITC-Z zone to see how that has shifted through time. And we produced this record. Most of you probably, I know Lex has probably seen this, and so has Jörg. But this is a record that now goes back into the 900s AD. So it's from 2000 out here. This is the tree ring record built from about 100 trees of Phocenia from the area where the plot is, and from the area where these eco trails are going through. And this is a very strong, robust picture of drought and wet periods over the last 750 years. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in it except to say that these red arrows represent the 3 biggest historically significant droughts of the last millennium. This is the 2 encore droughts at the time period where the Khmer civilization collapsed. We have a couple papers now that show how this was linked to that. And the big 18th century mega drought that shows up all across Southeast Asia. And that was responsible, or it certainly correlated to the time of all of the realignment of all the polities in Southeast Asia. Tai Son Rebellion in northern Vietnam was a big peasants' rebellion that was a response to drought and famine. And a lot of interesting things show up in this. First of all, we have a really strong El Nino signal in these. Every time you have a warm phase of El Nino, we get the biggest droughts in the record, the 2 Victorian Holocaust droughts, the 1877-8, 1888-89. Absolutely rocked this record. And this is so linked into ENSO, we were able to actually do a whole bunch of reconstructions with that. And the other thing with the wet periods, these big wet years that show up. So how this works into what we're doing initially in the cross-cutting initiative is actually looking at these at the whole forest from these plots that we put in where we've identified every species in a hectare. We have 64 species. We have the ability to now look at the imprint of climate on that region, but also a lot of these species have really solid ring structure, including a lot of the broadleaf species that we're looking at. And so we're doing all these things that are very intensive, labor intensive, which is why the Earth Clinic will be such a useful thing to have lots of pairs of hands of people to come in and help us do this work. But this is the hectare. This is broken up into 20-meter boxes and 10-meter boxes that show the kind of size distribution of tree species in there. We can analyze this a million different ways, and we've been doing that. But what we're interested in primarily here is how drought plays a role, how hydroclimate plays a role in what we see on the landscape. And there's some surprising things showing up now that I won't have time to go into today, but what we have here is wet area index for all of Southeast Asia and dry area index, which is a percentage of the region of Southeast Asia based on the Monsoon Asian Drought Atlas. That's either in drought, in the case of red, that's greater than -4 PDSI, or greater than +4 PDSI, which is the wet periods in blue. So this is just a really good measure of wetness and dryness. And what we're finding is that these periods where you have a big dry followed by a big wet are very critical for recruitment episodes in forest. So that's kind of where we're going with this right now. This first field school and this first cross-cutting initiative program is following up on this project but involving the field school to get the amount of data needed for doing that. And what's kind of cool about this, we can look at tree rings in a whole slew of ways. The most obvious one is just looking at the width of ring, which is what we typically do. Here's one ring that starts there and grows in that direction of Pinus mercusii, but it has these false rings in it, here and there. There's another one here. These false rings are actually a proxy for monsoon breaks. So periods during the monsoon when you have a big drought that would be of a sufficient duration to actually trigger lignification in conifers, we're able to look at sub-annual resolution in monsoon variability, something that no one's ever done before in these tropical areas. These might go back 300 to 400 years. The other thing is the measurement of early wood and late wood widths in species like this pseudotsuga, Douglas fir from Vietnam, that has beautiful early wood, late wood width that are not correlated with each other. So we're able to tease out a later monsoon and an early monsoon signal. So we have a grad student working on that. And then one final thing that I'll point out that we're doing with these is taking microcores from trees no, this is the last slide, so won't tarry too much. We're able to actually look in a forward growth modeling sense at inputs on daily or weekly timescales to be able to grow tree rings with mathematical models called forward growth modeling. And we're just starting to do this now in the tropics. This happens to be from a cedar tree from the temperate zone, but this is cored at different time periods through the year, and you can actually watch this cell of the cells of the same tree grow and then lignify here to form this late wood. This process here is really strongly linked into climate. In fact, there's different ways of mapping it in, but by measuring the thicknesses, the volume of the lumens, the hole in the middle of the tracheids, or the thickness of the cell walls, you get these beautiful records that can say something about growing season climate that's subannual in nature. And I'll just say one thing about climate there. There's these big climate shifts that have taken place over the last millennium. One of them being the intertropical convergence zone shift that about the end of the medieval period and lasted or kept itself positioned south about 5 degrees of its current position before it rebounded at the end of the Ice Age. This is something that's testable by that network of tree rings that I showed you earlier. And it's something that we'll be looking at. And then the other thing is the big disturbance factor that's kind of hard for us to model are tropical cyclone hits. So we get these big storms that come in, and there's ways of actually determining which of these sort of disturbance events are triggered by this type of climatic event by looking at things like ultra depletion of O18 in the isotope record, for example. So with that, I'll leave that there, but that gives you an idea of what we're doing.
Thank you, Brandon. Time for questions.
So my question pertains to the Earth Clinic part of the project. So in addition to setting up the field school, what do you see as the sort of local sustainable development potential? Do you have some specific goal for the sort of ecotourism, and how do you plan to measure it?
Yeah, that is the whole point of this field school is something that initially, I mean, I hope that Columbia would actually take an interest in maintaining, for instance, making it accredited to people or make it even part of the Columbia class at some point. I've been in discussions with a few people about that very thing. But for the most part, as a paying field school, it'd be modeled after what Sichuan in China, in Yunnan, what they have. And people do come and pay to go to this every year, and there's a percentage of the money, the revenue that we would bring in that would pay for locals to attend. So it's paid for people from scholarships for people from Hanoi, from Saigon, and from other cities in Vietnam initially. And then ultimately would like this to be something that would bring in Cambodians from Royal University in Phnom Penh Forestry and some of the other regional universities. So we have this aim of making this something that like, I don't want to run this. I just want to see it get off the ground. And I see it as a way of funding protection of this. Because, I mean, even as the last couple of years, I've seen parts of the forest disappear. And so that concerns me. I mean, I'm opportunistic and I'll cut cross-sections so I can analyze the rings in it. But I'd really rather take my 5-millimeter cores out of the trees so I can go back 100 years from now, or my great-grandchildren can.
Other questions?
Lex.
Isn't a lot of the cutting of the forest driven by for growing coffee? Is that true in that area? And what can you do about it realistically?
That is true, but it's true here. I want to show you where that's true. Not in this part of the forest, it's not. This is primarily value of this type of timber. This is extremely valuable. It replaces hinoki. The Japanese or the Taiwanese and the Koreans use it in the shrines, which they can no longer cut their own. I wanted to get back to this map here. Where the coffee plantations are in this is the buffer zone. This whole area around here, this is another national park that's virtually undeveloped. So all this, where this road is, the coffee development's taking place there. In here you actually have mostly Pinus kessia, which is a fire-maintained landscape. And the old growth is being sort of winnowed away into these little patches. So some of that is related to the coffee clearing, but most of that takes place in that outside the national park. This is mostly poaching for wood. In fact, Yangli Station, where we're holding the first field week, is right here. The road to Nha Trang goes right through here to Cam Bay and Nha Trang. And that is an area where right off the road there's 1,000-year-old Phocaenia, Pinus dilatensis, Pinus krempfi, all these rare and endemic conifers. And the wood's so valuable that that's what's being cut, because you can get at it from the road, and the rangers don't make enough money to really want to risk their lives going to stop someone from doing it. So, I think we've had an impact here, particularly when it comes to this area in the park here. We have an eco trail that goes up the top of Biduk Mountain. It's about here. And that's where some of the oldest trees are. And now there's enough traffic in there, and the locals are guiding people in there daily. And they seem to be doing a really good job of recognizing that that's their livelihood now.
So if you have questions to any of the other speakers, I see Michael is still here, Jörg is here, Johannes is here. So if you want to come back to something that might have come up, listening to other talks, that's the time to do it.
Yeah, Brendan, just based on what you're saying, it doesn't sound like this is a good market for alternative fuels if they're surrounded by all this wood. Or could you make the case to them that a different way of getting their energy?
Well, solar is something that we had a problem with putting instruments in, because during the peak of the wet season, there's so little radiation, there's so little light, that we can't even really run the solar batteries, not very easily. It can change, like in one day you'll get bathed in sunlight, but so solar's not viable for the part of the year where they really want it. They use the pines, which is very flammable, for starting fires, for cooking fires, so that's done a lot. So wood is probably their big energy source, unfortunately. But most of it's the Pinus kessia, which is like a weed. They maintain that. It's like a weed, really.
Thank you.
I just have a bit of a technical question for the last two presentations. So they both had the CCI component and then the Earth Clinic. I'm not sure if I understand that correctly, but like the CCI seemed to be sort of more the research, and then the Earth Clinic more like the applied side. Did you first apply for one and then the Earth Clinic came afterwards, or was it right from the start sort of combined?
Do you want to answer that?
So in my case, the CCI was a very small grant. So this was 2 years ago. I just basically got a very small grant to organize a little meeting here to do some planning, and then that planning in part led to the Earth Clinic. So all the field work in my case was done with the Earth Clinic grant.
In our case, we applied for them both at the same time, and they both had a budget attached to them. And what happened, what we wrote in there was that if they both got funded, there'd be cost sharing, because the same players were involved in both. So the cost of tickets to fly, who's that? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm speaking to the wrong person. The tickets to fly everyone over would now be bought out of one pool rather than having, so it ended up being very cost effective to do it this way.
But on that technical question, it can go, usually it goes from CCI to Earth Clinic, but they can be interlinked.
Yeah.
And we also, as Johannes pointed out, if we get a project for either one of them where we feel that there is really merit and that we would like this to be developed, but it has a relatively large budget, we feel it's not yet fully worked out, we sometimes make a decision to say, well, give this group a few $1,000 or maybe $10,000 so that they can have either a meeting or a networking event where they bring people in that we think should actually be part of it. So there are many steps that can be taken, and then we go back to the PIs and say, would that work for you? And if they think that this is a viable pathway for them, then this is sometimes the first step, and then they come back with a more worked out proposal and a different and large group of collaborators. Any other questions? Yes, over here.
The average number of collaborators per successfully funded project.
The average number can vary widely. I think we encourage, or it's actually a requirement that you cross 2 to 3, 4 areas where you bring people in with that expertise. And that sort of gives you a sense of how many people there have to be. Sometimes there's a core group of, let's say, 2 to 5 PIs, but then they network and have collaborators who are not as intensely involved, but who are sort of giving advice to the project, and that can easily go up to 10 or so. So I would say the group size varies anywhere from a minimum of 3, I would say, to I have seen proposals that have networked up to 15 with a core group of 5 to 7. So there is flexibility. That the key is for the CCI that you really demonstrate that you can branch a single or 2 related disciplines to illuminate a problem from different perspectives that goes beyond, let's say, natural science only, or engineering only, or social science only, into a domain where you try to bring these things together. And these are the typical problem-driven projects, sustainable development projects. They actually intrinsically need that. Otherwise, you see immediately that this only can, address one facet of it. I think we have exhausted the questions. I just wanted to remind you again that the deadline for the new set of proposals is April 8th, and that's the same for CCI and for the US Clinic. And we typically try to get them looked at and responses written up by July 1. End of June, give or take a few weeks. Sometimes it doesn't work out exactly like that, but mostly we manage to get notifications of people by July 1. And I hope you could see from what was presented, it's a large variety. There are more junior, more senior people. They are, smaller footprints, bigger footprints. The key really is that it addresses the mission of the US Institute, which is pathways towards a sustainable future. So if you have ideas, we welcome people who have not been part of the so-called core of the EI. We have actually funded people who came from the outside. I mean, there is a group that sort of comes back every so and so often, but there are also people who come in from areas of Colombia that were not connected to the Earth Institute before, and that's actually something we would like to encourage, would like to see, because often that's the first step in for somebody who, was actually working in a different part, and then makes connections and becomes a more key player in sustainable development in the Earth Institute. So we are looking out for these. It's not that this is something that's for the quote-unquote formal EI community. It's really Columbia-wide. And we encourage young people to apply. If you're junior, let's say postdoc, to take one example, we want to make sure that there is somebody there who takes the project over if the postdoc moves on, because that by nature of the position that happens. So but all of that is actually written up in the guidelines. They are on the webpage. But if there are any questions, please, let us know.
So how many projects for each year in terms of both authors, clinic and
Varies too, depending on the quality of the projects and the size of the budgets. The CCI, we typically have about $200,000 to give. So if you say we have an average, then you can go up to 50, but the average is more like 30K. So if you take that, it's about 5 to 7. We had years where we had less than that because we just didn't have the kind of projects that were suitable for it. And we had years where we had a few where we had a lot of good ones and a few had a smaller budget. So we might have given up to, but I don't think we ever gave more than 8. So I would say between 5 and 7 is sort of the kind of thing for the CCI. For the Earth Clinic, it's usually closer to 3 to 5.
How many applications do you have?
The applications also vary, but in general they have increased over the years. So the last round we had about 20. Was that total or for CCI? I think it was just for
CCI.
Just for CCI it was about 20. So you have, if you want to translate that in a rough success rate, it's about a third plus. A lot of NSF programs now are below 10, so you can gauge that. I think that the good projects, the ones that are thought out, have a nice set of complementary PIs, have a good chance to get through.
One remark, I'm a rookie to all of that, but since I am involved in that, there's quite some flack coming down on the cross-cutting initiative from sources you know much better. You have heard this argument, of course, many times. But there's so much money have been invested in that over the years, and if you look really what comes out, it's kind of dismissed. So is there any thinking of, and I think that probably just the problem of featuring the success and how to count that and how to monitor it. Is there any kind of thinking in the leadership to do a few steps to kind of make that clearer to the broader community?
So several levels to that. Yes, over the years we have spent quite a bit of funding, but in the grand scheme of the budget. So you have to take that in the context of the total EI budget, which right now is about $125 million. So we are spending about 200 to get innovative things going. That's one way you can look at it. The other one is we are actually asking for reports, interim reports and final reports, so we are keeping track and we're giving feedback, and that also feeds into decisions when PIs are coming back. We did have one or two of these symposia in the past to highlight that. We will keep doing that. We also had a formal evaluation of the program where PIs were asked, what did they get out, where we actually listed what kind of products came out in terms of publications, other legacies, fundraising, and so on and so forth. So I think we are following that, and we did adjust the program along the ways. But the evaluation was positive. We also asked people, particularly the ones who have been funded, about how they look at the value compared to other investments that you can make, and that was in general for both of them. We did that when it was done by Teachers College, so we didn't do that ourselves. It was very positive. So yeah, you always, whenever you get into something that is seed funding, there are some people who say seed funding is a waste of resources. There is, let's see, Lex is probably the only member of the steering committees who is here right now. Personally, I think a lot of things have been started, including some of the centers in the past. The Water Center was originally a grant. The Energy Center was originally a grant from the CCIs. So these were bigger initiatives. Yeah. But then other things have been started that I think would not have happened if we wouldn't have had this competition. And I think it's one way to reach out and let people try some things. And even if if some of the successes are not coming as people would expect, not every of these things, this is high risk. So I actually count on some of these things not working out. But if you are really sort of an NSF, I'm not preaching to the I'm saying I'm meaning the community. I'm just saying if people are looking at that like an NSF grant where you really have a low risk investment these days and everything can be accounted in numbers, that's a different thing. We are not trying to do that. We try to really take high risk on ideas that are novel, and we really want that to continue.
Yeah, Michael was mentioning that, right? Raised 10 times what he got from the CCI right away.
And there are examples where entire lines of inquiry have been started and have continued. But you always will hear some criticism of seed funding projects. Any other questions, comments? Doesn't seem to be the case, so we're looking forward to getting a new round of proposals.